Welcome to Knife Chats. If you like this video, please take a moment to leave a comment. Thank you. So I just picked up this wonderful Stockman by W.R. Case & Son and thought I need to do a video on this knife because it is so cool. And then I realized I've yet to get around to doing that video about the history of the Stockman knife. So I thought, all right, I need to wait on this and get about doing that video about the history of the traditional pattern knife, the Stockman. This is especially the case because a lot of people were asking me why it wasn't one of my top 5 knives. So I'm going to try and wrap all that up, and then I'll come back later and do a video about this wonderful knife in this box. So first of all, just looking at the table here, you can see that Stockmans come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. And that's one of the reasons why it's hard for me to choose it as one of my top 5 favorites, because it does come in so many varieties. It's hard to decide which one is actually the standard Stockman. In fact, there really isn't a standard Stockman. It is really just an entire family of knives that are designed in about the same way, and they do come in all sizes and shapes. And I think it is probably more produced than the Trapper, and probably more people carry some variety of a Stockman than those who carry Trappers. So even though Case says that the standard Trapper is their #1 seller, I bet even Case sells more Stockmans overall than they do Trappers. Now, the origin of the Stockman knife is really interesting because these knives were made specifically for people in the United States, but they were not being made in the United States originally. They're actually being made by knife makers in Sheffield, England. And the reason this pattern came about is because suddenly peace broke out in the United States. Back in the early 1860s, there was this thing going on called the Civil War, or the War between the states, depending on where you're geographically located in the United States. And the cutlery industry in England was making a killing selling knives to both the North and the South. And it really helped their production kick off, and they really expanded, and they were doing great. And then when the war ended, their market dried up. And it was like, how do we continue to sell knives in the United States? They're not going to be going after all these big Bowie knives or anything else. We need to find something that we can sell to Americans because our livelihood depends on selling knives in America. The answer to their prayers was the cattle drives. Northern markets were starving for beef. It was down in the South, especially out in the Southwest, and they needed to get that beef to market. So the long cattle drives out of Texas up into Kansas started happening, and that was a saving grace for the Sheffield cutleries. Depending on who you ask, either the various cattle barons were asking Sheffield, England, to send them knives, and sending them information on what kind of knife they wanted. Or the other story is that the various knife makers in Sheffield, England, sent people over here to actually observe the cattle drives and determine what would be the best knives. I have a feeling it's kind of a mixture of both stories, that the knife makers were sending people over here, observing how the knives were being used and how they could be better used. And also they were getting a lot of input from the people who were actually using the knives on how to improve them. So what the cutlers did is they settled on a frame that was already very popular in the United States, which was a large equal end frame. This frame was more popular in the Americas than it was actually in Europe. And the initial ones were just cattle knives that had either a very large clip blade or a large spear blade. Actually, more often it was a spear blade than a clip blade, and then a secondary pin blade. Now this is a modern era one by Marvels. You notice it's got a nice etch on there that says cattle knife, but this is basically the original cattle knives, or the original Stockmans. A very large equal end knife with 2 blades that don't say anything about them as being a real Stockman knife, but this is the way they began. But over time, the Sheffield knife makers started looking at other blades that were going to work better for the cattlemen, even though this type of knife would remain popular throughout all the cattle drives, the simple knife with either a large spear and a secondary pin blade on basically just an equal end jackknife. But two blades, actually three blades, became things that were often requested for by the people who were actually running the cattle drives. And those blades are your spay blade, the punch blade, and the sheep foot. And here we have a smaller equal end knife. This one is on a 3 3/4 inch frame or 3 5/8 inch frame, and this is very typical of the later cattleman knives that came out in the 1880s and 1890s and remained popular for some time. This one here is by Hammer brand and it's probably from the 1930s or 40s. You see it's got a nice spear blade, and then its secondary blades are a sheep foot and a punch. And this knife, this style of knife, was often referred to, even though it's on a Stockman frame or a Stockman, is often called the cattle knife or the cattleman's knife, and it's because of the punch and also because of the equal end frame. So Stockman knives on these kind of frames are often called a cattle knife or a cattleman's knife, simply because of the shape and because they are closer to what the original cattle knife was like. Now, why these blades? Let me close this up so I don't cut myself. Well, the spear blade or the large clip blade is your primary blade that you're using for all of your cutting chores and everything, and it's just a very useful blade. And so, you know, you use it for your cooking, you use it for cutting up your food, you use it for whittling, you use it for cutting large items, cutting wood and everything else. If you need to cut something, you usually use the large blade. The sheepfoot blade has a couple uses. Now, one of the primary uses for the sheepfoot blade is basically cutting your chaw of tobacco so you can chew tobacco. But the other use for it was for cleaning up hooves and any kind of problem with a hoof on a horse or a cow, so that the cow or horse can continue to move. So it's used for cleaning up things, you know, shaving off bad spots on a hoof or something like that. And so it was very useful for you know, maintaining your horse hoof or your cow hoof. The punch blade, as we all know, is used for punching holes in leather and everything else. So that's what the punch blade was for. And so it's really useful for those people out on the range and doing cowboy work. So that's one of the versions. The other version has the spay blade. Now here's a modern era cattle knife also, this time by U.S. Classics, and it has your clip blade and the sheepfoot blade and the spay blade. Now, anyone who doesn't know already, the spay blade is used for castrating your bulls and everything else, but it's also used for any kind of cutting where you do not want to be puncturing anything. So you can also use it for a little bit of gutting and everything else, or for cleaning animals where you're not wanting to puncture like intestines or anything. So that's why the spay blade is there, and it's also a very useful blade. You know, it's not a sharp point. That's the important thing of it. But they use it mainly for castrating animals, and so this was probably more often used on the ranch instead of on the cattle drive. But those are those shapes of the earliest of the Stockman knives, and they were by this time being called a Stockman knife or a ranch knife, a cattle knife, all sorts of names given to it, but today we know them as a Stockman. Now, interesting enough, as the cattle drive started to fade, you actually saw the cattle knife or the Stockman knife evolve. It no longer remained a equal end knife in the cigar shape. It started becoming more and more often a serpentine type shape. This really started happening into right at the end of the 1800s, moving into the 1900s, and this style of serpentine frame became more popular for the Stockman knives. And this is when you really start seeing variety come about. Now, one of the interesting things about this is the clip blade also becomes more popular than the spear blade by this time. And it does seem to standardize a little bit with the sheep foot and the spade blade being the other two blades that are prominently found on the knife, and they are now almost always with three blades. So the two blade and the four blade pattern seems to have gone away. And typically what you see on the knives starting around this time, and probably even a little earlier, is you have the clip and still sometimes a spear blade at the top, along with a sheep foot also at the top, and a spade blade at the bottom end. And those three blades tend to define what a Stockman is, and that still remains the case today. The Stockman tends to be a three-blade knife with most often a clip blade, a sheep foot blade, and a spade blade. And most often these days it is made on a serpentine frame. However, other frames still do exist these days. But one thing you have to also look at here is, so while this is a relatively large frame, you have this one here, which is only 3.5 inches or 3 5/8 of an inch. And then you have this one over here, which makes this one look big because it's only 2 5/8 inches long, and they're all Stockmans. So you have a large Stockman, a medium Stockman, and a small Stockman. And even among the medium Stockmans, there's a lot of variety. Basically, a medium Stockman is any knife that's over 3 inches long and under 4 inches long. So we have this Sowbelly here that's also a medium Stockman. They call it a Sowbelly. This one up here, this cattle knife, is 3.5 inches long, so it's still also a Stockman, but they call it a cattle knife. And then you have this little guy here that's really just a small Stockman, and here's another one that's 2 3/4 inches long, also another small Stockman. But you can see there's quite a bit of variety among them. And not only is there a lot of variety in the sizes, there's also still some variety among the blades. Now, we saw this one from the 1930s that has a spear blade, and you will also find other Stockmans that have a spear blade. But just among the clip blades, there's so much variety that it's almost crazy. So here's one on this little Stockman, and then if you look at the clip blade on this large Stockman, and here's another large Stockman. Those two are pretty much the same, you know, when it comes to clip blades. But when you start getting into the medium-sized frame, actually this is a large Stockman too. Notice the difference in the clip blades on these two knives. Definitely enough that someone would almost think of it as a different pattern simply because of the shapes of those clip blades. They're both, well, this is a 4-inch Stockman, so it's a large Stockman. This is a large Stockman. The case is also a large Stockman. The clip blades are quite a bit different. And this, the Premble, instead of a spade blade, once again, it has a punch like the old cattle knives, and they would still call this a cattle knife, even though it's no longer on a cigar-shaped frame. And the front blade is a spade blade, or actually, yeah, it's a spade blade. So it has a spade blade, a punch, and a very slender California clip blade, but it is still basically just a Stockman. And remember that little 2 5/8" knife? Not only does it have a clip blade, the back blades end up being a really closer to a coping blade than an actual sheep foot, and the back blade is a pin blade. So even though it's called a Stockman, it has the blades that you would normally find on a whittler. So, and we'll talk about whittlers later, because basically this is a whittler, but it's not laid out in the way that most people think whittlers are laid out, because quite frankly the whittler is also a variation of the Stockman. We'll talk about that in a different video. And if you're just looking at medium Stockmans, here's a medium Stockman by Winchester, and if you notice the sheep foot blade, it's kind of proud there. But you have other, this here is one by Rough Rider, and if you notice the sheep foot blade is well buried inside there. Still a sheep foot blade, but it just doesn't sit up as high. Get it out. Maybe it should sit up higher. So the sheep foot blades are not that much difference in size, but it drops further into the frame. So depending on what type of medium Stockman you like, there's going to be quite a bit of variety among those. They're both serpentine Stockmans. The latest one I got is also a medium Stockman, but it's once again on a cigar frame. I'll show that one in a different video. And then probably the most popular among medium Stockmans is the Sowbelly, and it's almost a large type of knife because of how wide the frame is compared to your typical medium Stockman. So this is 3 3/4 inches. This one's 3 5/8 inch, I think. You can see that the length of them is not much different, but body-wise, the Sowbelly is much bigger, and because of that, the blade thickness is also quite a bit more. So you can see there's so much variety in the Stockman that that's why I like to think of it more as a family of knives, and there's really no specific knife that is the standard among it. And it will vary from maker to maker, but what you're always looking for on it are usually 2 blades that open at the top, which are most often a clip blade these days and a sheep foot blade. And then most often on the back side you'll have a spay blade, and the spear blade tends to be in the front of the knife, with the other 2 blades sharing one common channel behind the main blade. So do I like Stockmans? Yeah, I think they're terrific knives. I think they're almost a perfect knife for an everyday carry knife even. The thing is my everyday carry knife is really a variation of the Stockman. It just has slightly different blades. Because when you get right down to it, if you look at this knife, the Cub Scout knife, what do you have? You basically have a knife that is laid out on an early Stockman frame. You've got the main blade in the front, and then you have 2 secondary blades in the back. One of those blades is the punch blade, just like early Stockmans. The only difference is, instead of having a sheep foot blade in the front, you have your can opener screwdriver. But otherwise, you can see the family resemblance between this Cub Scout knife and an early Stockman or cattle knife. They actually share the same frame and the same basic layout of blades. So there you have it. My Stockman knife tends to be a camp knife or a scout knife, but in theory it's pretty much a very close relative of the Stockman. So just to recap, The cattle knife, or the Stockman, came about because the Civil War ended and the Sheffield knife industry needed to find a new knife to sell to Americans. And their saving grace was the cattle drives. And so they came out with the cattle knife, and that evolved into the Stockman. The original ones usually had two blades. They ended up with as much as four blades on them, but eventually it ended up settling down to something like this, a serpentine frame by the 1900s, early 1900s, with usually a large clip blade, a sheep foot blade, and a spay blade, or sometimes a punch blade. And the sizes started changing as society started changing, often getting smaller with your medium stockmans and even your small stockmans. But they're all part of the same family, and they all came from a desire from the Sheffield knife industry to continue to sell knives in America. And from there, a wide variety of Stockman knives came about, and probably some of the most popular knives in America today, at least among the traditional pattern knives. Hope that helps. I know it's a little bit disjointed, and that's probably why it took me so long to get around to doing this video, because there's so much information about Stockman knives, and there's such a variety that I have no idea how to pick which one I would consider the standard Stockman. I know what my favorite is, and that'll be in another video when I show it to you. So there you have it. For me, the Stockman is more of a family of knives as opposed to a particular knife, and it's a terrific family. I think today maybe the closest thing to a standard would probably be the Sowbelly, but even that varies from manufacturer to manufacturer. And as you can see, the knives that were called the cattle knife or the Stockman in the beginning bear little resemblance to what you see today as a Stockman. So who knows what the next generation of Stockman is going to look like. So that's why it's very hard for me to pick a standard Stockman. That said, if the Stockman is your favorite knife, I'd love to hear from you, especially just which Stockman is your favorite knife. Is it the medium Stockman, the large Stockman, the Sowbelly, small Stockman? What are the blade choices that you want on your Stockman? I'd love to hear about it because, like I said, to me, it's a family of knives. It's a fantastic knife, and to me, it is the true American knife that won the West. In any case, there's my thoughts on the Stockman. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Knife Chats, and if you did, please like and share it with your friends. Comments are always welcome. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'll know when the next episode of Knife Chats is up online. Thanks again. Hope to see you soon.